Clockwork Orange and Cool Hand Luke are both psychoanalytic theory films which follow each main character's struggle through inferiority. A thorough use of cinematography is displayed through camera shots and mise-en-scène in order to symbolically isolate and develop each character in contrasting institutional settings. These institutional settings will act as an anchor for comparison, as the institutions in both movies hold a great significance to the main characters. Both films' main characters are anti-heroes. An anti-hero is defined as the savior or guardian of a certain group who lacks conventional heroic qualities. The characters are cleverly conveyed in this way through cinematic techniques, specifically cinematography. Another ostensible similarity exists in the debatable category of theory the films fall into, the psychoanalytic film theory. This is a theory where the film revolves around a main character who is distinctly and perhaps overwhelmingly influenced by his or her surroundings. The two anti-heroes endure the overt influence of the oppressive authorities as represented through the film's mise-en-scène. In the case of A Clockwork Orange, Alex finds his insurgent and violent personality stripped of its humanity by the influence of a forceful and repressive government. On the other hand, Luke from Rosenberg's film finds himself involved in a personal battle which stemmed from the repressive authority of the chain gang prison. There are several more indistinct parallels between the films, including ill-defined symbols which are of course open to the viewer's interpretation. In a dystopian England, traditional morals seem to be abolished as the youth violently ravage the streets. When a teenager Alex gets set up by his former gang of delinquents, he is imprisoned for his violent nature and is later given a government treatment in order to reverse his sick desires. The story prompts several questions that essentially validate the being of a human. What director Stanley Kubrick did with Anthony Burgess's novel A Clockwork Orange was quite profound. Without the comprehensive value of visual sentences to describe Alex and his struggle, Kubrick was able to establish the boy's isolation through camera shots and mise-en-scène, whilst maintaining sufficient pace throughout the film. After committing a foolish and seemingly non-punishable crime, Luke is sent to a chain gang prison in the Deep South where he is instantly recognized by the guard as an anti-conformist. After becoming a notorious anti-hero among the inmates and a few attempted escapes, he is brutally tortured and mentally broken down. Similarly to A Clockwork Orange, Cool Hand Luke is an adaptation to Don Pierce's novel of the same title, and director Stuart Rosenberg also cleverly designed the sets and arranged the camera shots to develop Luke into an isolated character who goes against the tide of conforming with society. Both films are effective in creatively depicting each character's destruction. Though Alex's situation is a question of humanity and Luke's is one of authority, both men are nonetheless stripped of something valuable, their freedom to think and act. In the opening scenes of Stanley Kubrick's film, Alex is portrayed as the evident ringleader of his droogs. The camera shots do not begin to subtly isolate Alex until it is made clear that his droogs are unhappy with his dominating presence. This shot of Alex descending down a flight of stairs while his droogs suspiciously wait for him is a prime example of Kubrick's clever mise-en-scène. There is an apparent disruption in the dynamic of the gang, and this scene perhaps signals the beginning of Alex's demise. As shown here, the effect of the wide lens and Alex's centralized position clearly establishes him departing from not society, but sentience. The cats symbolize a sort of animalistic freedom which both animals and humans share, and when Alex exits the door, it ultimately determines his fate as someone who cannot choose to act evil. The beginning of Cool Hand Luke portrays Luke as a sort of lone wolf who despises the government. The man is cutting the heads off parking meters. It doesn't get any more anti-establishment than that. This slanted shot seems to represent his slipping away from society's rules. When the movie first reveals the chain gang, they are shown in a very uniform fashion. It isn't until Luke's appearance that the shots become interesting and different. One of the film's most definitive scenes is the brief close-up of the warden's glasses, where one side shows the prison bus escorting inmates, Luke among them, to their new living grounds. This evidently foreshadows a conflict between the protagonist and the warden, just as Alex's separation foreshadows his unjust fate. So, as stated earlier, both directors are successful in utilizing film techniques to establish the characters as ones who have been heavily influenced by society. Both films utilize Christ imagery, however, the executions differ. Alex needs the accompaniment of God, while Luke is a metaphorical God in the lives of the inmates. There is a prominent crucifixion motif throughout the narrative of Cool Hand Luke, which establishes the protagonist as a symbolic embodiment of Christ. This leaves the audience with an array of possible interpretations of Luke's character. The analogy to be argued here is that Luke is suffering for the inmates as Christ suffered for his followers. The role of the protagonist in the prison was one to act as a guiding light for the rest of the chain gang, who lacked proper authority and instead latched onto Luke's nonchalant and noble character. There are several instances of this motif being represented through camera shots and the positioning of objects on the set. One example, which clearly shows the inmates feeding off of Luke, comes here, when Luke is forced to eat a substantial amount of rice or else suffer a brutal night in the box. The camera zoom perhaps acts as an emphasis on the inmates literally and figuratively feeding off of him. This is a motif expressed throughout the film. Luke's enticing rebellious spirit is something the lost inmates strive to attach to. When Luke accepts the challenge of eating 50 eggs in a short amount of time, the motif is slightly reversed. Instead, the inmates are feeding him the eggs, possibly representing their energy keeping him going. When Luke finishes the eggs, he lays out on the table in the shape of Christ on the cross. The camera shot is a bird's eye view and hits the motif home that Luke is a Christ figure in the lives of the inmates. Here, in A Clockwork Orange, Alex asks questions to the prison chaplain. We see that Alex is in fact not alone. The isolated wide-angle shots that we'd been seeing before with Alex in the middle have been replaced with one of both the chaplain and Alex, implying that the voice of God is with him. A Clockwork Orange and Cool Hand Luke both ultimately portray characters who have been profusely influenced by society. Through cinematography and mise-en-scène, the directors are able to depict Luke and Alex as people who, despite being robbed of logical human rights, will forever live in exception to the rest of society. In Alex's case, the final scene shows him dreaming of acts which he was scientifically forbidden to do, establishing him as someone who will never change as long as he is a human. Luke ends up being murdered by the warden, something that could have easily been predicted based upon early camera shots. Nevertheless, his name lives on as the status of a legend who would rather die than conform.